How desperate did 2020 get you? How many times did you think, what the hell is going on? How often did you want to shout at your kids or, let's be honest, kill your partner when they came to disturb you during one of those endless online meetings? In other words, what effect did 2020 have on your resilience? Let's talk about your resilience. From the title of my talk, inspired by a 30-year-old book by John Cleese, you might be thinking that I was born a comedian and an optimist. Well, I'm sorry to burst your bubble right from the go. In fact, when I was 6 years old, I wasn't a very popular kid in primary school because I was rather shy and gloomy. My parents were struggling financially after a bankruptcy, and I was ashamed that I knew what a bailiff was and why he loved our furniture so much that he always came to collect it. One day, my teacher in the first year of primary school asked us if somebody wanted to tell a joke in class. Now, nobody volunteered, but incidentally, I overheard my older brother the day before telling a very dirty joke involving a cowboy, a wedding ring, a horse, and a prostitute. Now, of course, I had no idea why it was funny. Since 6 years old, I didn't really know what a prostitute was. And don't worry, I won't tell the dirty joke in this talk, but I decided to take my chance and I told the joke, proudly standing up on my chair in class. Of course, none of my 6-year-old classmates laughed, but my teacher literally bent over laughing. I'm proud to say my school results were excellent that year. So it was my first experience of the power of humor. I also remember my father telling us very often, well, maybe we're poor, but at least we laugh a lot. So it's safe to say that I grew up in a family where humor was very important to deal with life. In fact, before I became a professional writer and director, humor was my social currency. Because being funny was the only way to get invited to interesting parties without having to pay. And look, now it even gets me to do TEDx talks. Mama! That's why today I want to show you how thinking like a comedian can become your strategy to recalibrate and boost your mental resilience at home and at work. Let's go, because the need is big indeed these days. Did you know that in Belgium, an estimated 1 out of 5 long-term sick leaves are due to mental problems caused by some form of stress? Now, you could argue that it proves that Belgians are a bunch of nutcases and lunatics anyway, but it's clear that our mental resilience has been under very big pressure for a long time worldwide. So how can we reinforce it? Now, maybe your first reflex now is to think of humor as fuel for optimism. And to me, the pinnacle of optimism is this. Indeed, you recognized Always Look on the Bright Side of Life, a tune from the final scene in Monty Python's movie Life of Brian. Do you also remember the exact scene it's part of? The main character, Brian, who has mistakenly been identified as the Messiah, finds himself crucified on Mount Golgotha, and while Brian faces his final hours, a fellow convict on the cross next to him starts singing this song to cheer him up. It's crazy, but it's funny. I was 14 when I saw this film for the very first time. And once again, it was a testimony to me that comedy often springs from a dark situation. In fact, it was Charlie Chaplin who said, "Comedy is inspired by contradictions. It's about what we feel is unjust, untrue, or illogical." And so I think our sense of comedy and the need for comic relief is a very basic human reflex to reboot our minds. The question is, of course, how do you access it consciously or purposely in times of need? And maybe you think now, I can't do this because I'm just not funny. I don't have that so-called comedy bone. Well, let me tell you another story. This is Viktor Frankl, a very famous psychiatrist from Vienna who spent several years in concentration camps during World War II. He survived stays in Auschwitz, Dachau and other grueling locations. And after the war, he wrote a book about it called The Meaning of Life. In this book, he describes how the horrors committed by the Nazis affected the prisoners mentally. Now, surprisingly, Frankl also writes about a couple of occasions where the need for prisoners to have a good laugh made them organize cabaret evenings in the barracks, even risking their lives in doing so. So to me, that's proof enough of the natural resilience inherent to any human, supported by comedy. In other words, everybody has this talent. You also. And yet, you'll probably think, for some people it's a lot easier than for some others. And that's also true. Interestingly, many of the comedians I worked with had to deal with some kind of trauma growing up. A couple of them were bullied at school, some found themselves socially isolated, and one of the most talented people I ever worked with suffered from severe episodes of depression. In all cases, they developed their sense of humor to protect themselves from getting scarred by life. So the temporary conclusion is that a time of crisis or conflict is actually a good opportunity to develop your resilience, or as the saying goes, while you're lying in the gutter, you can look up at the stars. Unless you're face down, of course, then you'll only see shit. But that's why, from my 30 years of professional comedy experience, I created a method. I teach people in resilience workshops to develop anybody's natural sense of humor in times of burnout, stress, depression or crisis. Now, this talk is too short to go through the complete process, of course, but as an advocate for more humor at work, I'm happy to disclose some elementary comedy tricks that will help you access 3 key elements to reinforce your mental resilience. Are you ready? Okay. The first reaction of a comedian to any situation is to question it. And in comedy, there's only one question, it's what if? Take for example the film The Life of Brian. The premise being, what if instead of Jesus Christ, a random nobody had mistakenly been identified as the Messiah? Indeed, comedians ask this what if question over and over again to find a detail that can be changed in the premise of a situation. Because in essence, a joke is a very simple construction. Take this one for example. My dad always knew I was going to be a comedian. Because when I was born he said, "Is this a joke?" Now, here's what happens in this classic one-liner. You start telling a story and your audience will try to predict the outcome of the story on the basis of their own premise, being that a father is usually proud of his newborn baby. Now, a good joke surprises the audience at some point by bending it to an unexpected outcome, which started from a different premise. In this case, the father being annoyed by the baby's ugliness. So the surprise is what makes the audience laugh. Indeed, the foundation of comedy is acknowledging an alternative, parallel version of reality. Now, considering that, you could say that Donald Trump is actually a great comedian, which he is, if you forget most things. But okay, what you do by asking the what if question consistently is to train your sense of reflection. And that's the first essential element of your mental resilience. Being able to reflect on a situation instead of just undergoing it. It means abandoning the premise that you're a powerless victim without any impact to someone who can consciously choose a reaction. To train your reflective talent, you question situations like comedians do by tweaking details. What if people in the Middle Ages were confronted with my clients or with my kids? What if extraterrestrials had to do with my boss? The what if question obliges you to come out of a tunnel vision you might feel trapped into and see some light at the end of it. Now, but of course, maybe you're a pessimist and you think, well, the light at the end of the tunnel might just be another train coming on. Yeah. To move from a negative premise into a positive one, you need to take yet another step. What blocks our view of a different reality is very often judgment. Our belief of what's right or wrong, good or bad. Now, to turn that around, there's no better exercise than to observe the way you judge yourself. So indeed, after reflection comes self-reflection. So I ask people in workshops to talk about a personal characteristic that causes them embarrassment. In the final step of this exercise, I make them imagine ways to talk proud or positive about their source of shame. To imagine situations where it would actually serve them. Let me give you an example. In one recent workshop, I had an IT consultant who just couldn't say no to a client, and which obviously caused a lot of stress. So I asked him to think of a story about how saying yes to everything would bring him wonderful discoveries in life. And he came up with the very funny and true anecdote of an adventurous and surprising Tinder date with a mysterious girl who turned out to be a transgender Jamaican. And by the way, they're a couple now. So you see, sharing your vulnerability or embarrassment can be funny, recognizable to others, and turning it around can create a release. It can be cathartic in many ways. Now, of course, what comedians aim for is to make other people laugh. Laughing in itself creates a moment of release and, as neurological research found, a moment of exploring new connections in your brain, the so-called aha moment. Now, a friend of mine is a firefighter. He once told me about his first assignment. Him and his colleagues had to cut 2 dead people out of a car wreck. Shocking. Now, when they finished the job, he was stunned to see his colleagues stop the truck on the way back just to pause and to share jokes in a way to overcome their own shock. Laughing out loud makes us produce so-called happiness hormones like endorphin, dopamine and others. And laughing together creates a sense of shared happiness and discoveries. And that's why, as a third and final element, I incite people to create specific humor moments at work or even during meetings. These are moments of release and bonding, essential to mental resilience. Maybe you're thinking now, but what if people get my jokes wrong or get insulted in some way? Well, let me tell you, the object of introducing humor in life should be to share experiences and emotions rather than to make fun of someone else. So focus on situations rather than on other people. Also, if you have to make fun of someone at work, then start by looking at yourself and your own embarrassing anecdotes. As a takeaway, I would like to offer you this formula. Comedy, ladies and gentlemen, equals drama plus time. Using a comedian's strategy in everyday situations to enhance your resilience is to create a mental space for reflection, self-reflection and release, to distance yourself from the drama. So what I'm calling you out to do from now on, and I suggest you do it at least twice a day, is step back from whatever you're doing and ask yourself, what if I change the premise of this situation? What's my judgment of it? Can I look at it in a reverse, funny way? And can I share my view with others in a funny way? I wish you a lot of success, lots of aha moments with release and cathartic laughs. Thank you.